The year is 1942 in the Soviet Union, and Yakov Pavlov is hiding inside of an apartment building, desperately holding off the German advance. The Germans were ruthless, but little did they know that this siege would continue for 60 more days. If we are to understand what was going on in what is now known as Pavlov's house, we will have to go back 2 years to France, the Battle of France. Common knowledge that the French immediately got defeated by the Axis powers. Well, the Soviets over there, like Pavlov, did not lose so easily. The biggest reason is the French had so few men and resources, while the Soviet Union had plenty. Contrary to popular belief, France wasn't bad at holding off the Germans. Although they did lose, they fought really hard instead of surrendering immediately. They also had the military advantage as they had more troops. With all this in mind, why did the French lose so early to the Germans? It's quite simple. The Germans famously focused their artillery and army on the Ardennes, Belgium, and other difficult terrain, and the majority of the armies in the north. Smashing through these areas and surrounding the forces in Dunkirk made the remaining army so weak there wasn't much they could do against the Germans. The French were too busy learning from the previous war. They couldn't adapt to the bigger, bloodier, much more industrial one. On the contrary, the Germans adapted so well that they named their new strategy Blitzkrieg, or in German, Lightning War. After Dunkirk, France sued for peace in an armistice. The Prime Minister, Paul Reyard, then resigned, and Philippe Pétain became the new leader of what's now known as Vichy France. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a huge, rapidly industrializing nation run by the brutal dictator, in a lot of ways like Hitler himself, Joseph Stalin. 24 million Soviets died in that campaign. The worst part of that bloodbath is that 14 million of them was civilians. 14 million. It's not to say that the massacre was without consequences. The Germans themselves lost 8.6 million soldiers during the campaign. To see how much this shook the tides of the war in the US during the time, there was a lot of anti-communist sentiment. However, once the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, everything flipped around. American media praised the Russians, even to the point that Joseph Stalin was referred to as Uncle Joe. Anyway, back in the USSR, the Germans invaded the city of Stalingrad, or modern-day Volgograd. What resulted was by far the single most bloody battle in human history. How long it was. From August 23rd of 1942 to February 2nd of 1943, that's 5 months, 10 days, almost half a year. By September 9th of 1942, the Germans encircled the city to the west. The Soviets, however, had ordered their men to stay in close quarters combat with the Germans, so the Luftwaffe, or the German air forces, would have to avoid bombing so there would be no friendly fire. The death toll of the battle skyrocketed much higher when Hitler approved of Order 227, putting heavy penalties on any German officers who retreated, forcing them to stand and fight. This is also where Yakov Pavlov held off the Germans at aptly named Pavlov's house for 60 days. Red Army soldier Nikolai Maznitsa of the 9th Rifle Division tells of the German attack of Mamayev Kurgan.
An attack began in the morning of September 19th and lasted for 48 hours. The enemy was moving fast towards the summit of the hill. At times, it seemed as though they were invincible. Most of the German soldiers seemed to be drunk and threw themselves at the summit. After each round of Luftwaffe bombings, there was a moment of dead silence, and then the hill would come alive like a volcano. The slopes of the Kurgan were completely covered in the corpses of our fallen comrades and Germans. In some places, you had to move 2 or 3 bodies to even lie down.
Lines like those, it's no wonder that the battle had so many casualties. At 3 p.m. of November 19th, 1942, 10 Soviet armies totaling over 1 million soldiers came at the Germans with full force. This would not only be devastating, but Operation Torch in North Africa had just begun, forcing the Germans to multitask and take troops away from the USSR to fight there. Taking advantage of the Romanian flank in the south, the Russians encircled it, plus the 4th and 6th German armies. These encirclements were brutal for the Germans, as they were starved out of food for long periods of time. In summary, the Battle of Stalingrad was an extremely long, brutal, and in many ways seems more like a mini war of itself. However, eventually the Soviets managed to win. Throughout the rest of the war, Russia began to take back their land and then stretch into eastern Poland and eventually surround Berlin. Like I said in the beginning, looking at Soviet casualties and the fact most of France's defenses were forced to leave at Dunkirk before they could be useful, and how close Paris is to German borders, it's clear that the factor here was the Russian people being huge in numbers and the Russian borders being huge in size.